The women's national soccer team's fight for equal pay has been a big deal in soccer, in American sports, and just sports in general for a while now, especially because of this summer's World Cup, where, of course, the U.S. women's national team added a fourth star to these things by winning a back-to-back world championship. Well, it's been out of the news for a while. We're kind of in a lull right now, but this is something I've been wanting to do for a while. This is a project I've been wanting to make, and I figured because we're still in the middle of this, it's always going to be topical. So today, I want to go through the USWNT's fight for equal pay, what they've said they want, what they hope to accomplish, where we are in this whole process. US media, US sports media, does a really bad job of talking about soccer. Soccer is a sport we're just not comfortable with in the public consciousness. It's not something everybody knows about. Everyone knows who LeBron is, but like only a small segment of the American population could tell you about Chris Wondolowski. And so when American sports media tries to talk about soccer, they never do all that good a job of it. It can be something as simple as like a few months ago when Mike Greenberg on ESPN, instead of calling them FC Barcelona, called them FC Barcelona because he was just reading the word off the transcript and it didn't register for him what he was saying. There's also instances of confusing Athletic Bilbao with Atletico Madrid, things like that. So we're not comfortable talking about soccer in general, and part of the result of that is anytime a soccer story comes up, even when it's like this one and really doesn't have anything to do at all with soccer, we're just not comfortable talking about it. The media is not comfortable talking about it, and so it gets glazed over. There has been some really good reporting done on this lawsuit and the equal pay fight, but by and large, it's given lip service. It's just kind of glossed over. So I want to try to do a good explanation, a holistic explanation of how we got here, what's going on, etc. Because really, the only time we ever talk about women's soccer in any sort of depth is during women's soccer-specific TV coverage. And that doesn't happen that often. You get friendlies or other games they play, which might be televised on ESPN, but there's no pregame, there's no postgame. It's not like, baseball, basketball, football. I mean, heck, football on NFL Sundays, you can turn on any channel and get multiple and hours of pregame analysis, just basically regurgitating the same takes that everybody's had from the past week. We don't get that in women's soccer. The only time it comes close is for the Women's World Cup. And Fox's coverage this summer, if you watched it and if you're an astute observer of this game, you'll know that they didn't really want to get into this equal pay fight, and when they did, their panelists tended to side against the women fighting for equal pay. This specifically came up talking about Ada Hegerberg from Norway, who is the reigning winner of the Women's Ballon d'Or, basically awarded by the French Football Federation to the best women's player in the world. She didn't play because she didn't believe that Norway's women's team and their men's team receive equal treatment. And then the panelists on Fox basically panned that and said, you know what, we don't really think that she's made it clear what she wants when she had. And, again, it just really wasn't going to be the forum for this fight to take place and wasn't going to be the best place for that conversation to be held. And thus, if Fox wasn't going to hold it during the World Cup, no one was going to have it because there simply aren't those spaces for women's soccer. Before I go any further, I should say I'm not going to get overly into the weeds today, dollar amounts, really specific details, that sort of thing. Part of the reason for that is because a lot of this information isn't public. I'll talk more about that later, but something that makes this fight between the U.S. Soccer Federation and the women's national team so unique is we just have to go off what they say publicly. Also for this video, I'm only going to be focusing on the U.S. women's national team versus U.S. soccer. We aren't worrying about FIFA because that's a whole other can of worms in terms of how World Cup prize money is awarded. There's a huge disparity there, and there's a lot that can be done to close that gap. But right now, all I'm talking about is the U.S. Soccer Federation, a non-profit organization, and how they pay the people who work for them, specifically the players. So it might seem a little counterintuitive, but I'm actually going to start with talking about how the men's team is paid, because that's a good baseline for talking about how the women are paid and how you close the gaps between them. Because, of course, equal pay immediately evokes the idea that the women want to be paid equally to the men. So for men's soccer players, professional soccer players, they make most of their money like any athlete you're familiar with makes most of their money, and that is from a contract they sign with a professional club teams. Very similar to what you think of in basketball, football, anywhere else. Lionel Messi at Barcelona, for instance, makes about 40 million euros per year, about 50 million US dollars. So that's comparable to the huge contracts we're seeing now in the NBA. The NFL is catching up. Major League Baseball is almost there already. The average salary is a lot lower, but again, just to give you kind of a comparison on the high end, in terms of Major League Soccer though, the salaries are much, much lower. Michael Bradley, who's the current captain of the U.S. men's national team, is also the highest paid American player in MLS. He makes about $6.2 million per year. And the highest paid player in the league overall right now is Zlatan Ibrahimovic. He makes about $7 million a year. So we're not talking about world elite salaries here, but knowing what the American men's top flight is paying their best players is a good relative number to have in mind when we get to talking about how much money the women make. Should also note that in MLS, the minimum player salary is right around $70,000. So somebody coming right out of college or a player coming just out of his club's academy into the first team in Major League Soccer, those guys initially are making about 70 grand a year. Now, when the U.S. players go and play for the U.S. men's national team, they are paid in a way that makes a lot of sense. You get money for making a roster, you get money for starting a game, you get money for winning a game, you get money for advancing farther in tournaments like the CONCACAF Gold Cup or the World Cup. Basically, you get bonuses based on how much you play and how well you play. It's pretty straightforward and is really easy to understand. We don't need to get into the dollar amounts because, again, most of those dollar amounts are not public information, but the structure is more what we're concerned with here when we're discussing the differences between the men and the women. For the U.S. men's national team, it's an honor to get just selected for your country, and it's a nice little bonus on top of everything else that you already make. It's basically you're getting paid for your time while you're with the national team. The way the U.S. men's national team has gotten paid by U.S. Soccer has changed a lot over its history. Starting back in the 80s, they were just getting small daily stipends while they were on trips with the team to pay for food. They weren't getting paid a salary or anything of that nature. It was basically voluntary in the beginning. The amount of money changed slowly over the years, but it constantly lagged behind what the men were being paid. Just the way the team was being treated was laughable in comparison. There are stories about how when the women's national team first started out, their jerseys were actually hand-me-down from the men's team, and they'd have to spend the nights before matches altering the jerseys so that they would at least somewhat fit and that they'd be able to wear them. There's so much history to the U.S. women's national team, and it wouldn't have maybe even existed. Women's soccer might not have existed in the way it does now without the work that was done and the sacrifices that were made by the early on U.S. women's national team players. So currently, every member of the U.S. women's national team is playing her professional soccer in the National Women's Soccer League. That's the league here in the United States. It is the most successful U.S. women's soccer league to date. It's in its 7th season, which is finishing up. If you're not familiar, it's hard to overstate how big a deal it is that a women's soccer league has lasted this long in the U.S. This is the 4th or 5th iteration of an attempt to establish a league, most of the old ones coming off the backs of World Cups where there was a bit of a boom, but that boom never lasted. NWSL has been able to continue its success and looks like it's going to be a viable product long term, which is a really big deal. But even though U.S. women's national team players play for teams across the NWSL, the NWSL isn't paying them their contracts. U.S. Soccer is. Currently, U.S. Soccer has contracts with 20 USWNT players, each of whom they pay $100,000 a year to cover both club and country. As negotiated in the most recent CBA, which was signed back in 2017, that number of contracts is going to decrease down to 16, one a year, to 2021, and at that time, at least for now, that number will stay put. What's changing with that is there's this system of bonuses being introduced. The player pool, as far as contracts, used to be bigger. It used to be 23. And so basically the understanding was whoever was on the active roster the most that year was getting that contract. What's happened now is the bonuses that would be paid to players not included in that list, whoever appeared for the team, those have been increased. So the women are being paid more now if they aren't a contract player but make the national team for various things. So for example, there are 23 players usually on a roster for a tournament at any given time. That number might fluctuate a little bit. Right now with 20 contracts, and it'll be even more true when there's only 16, the core of the team is smaller and the number of players relying on those bonuses to make some extra cash is larger. Because in the NWSL, if you don't have one of these coveted national team contracts, you're not making a whole lot of money. Currently, the highest salary in the NWSL is just above $67,000 a year, which you'll remember is less money than the minimum for an MLS player. So the NWSL is not the greatest paying sports league in the world. So again, for these women on the U.S. women's national team, this money they get from U.S. Soccer is super important in their salary. So that's the biggest distinction. Basically, you have the core of the team. Most of this summer's World Cup team, in fact, are on these contracts. This $100,000 a year contract that is paid for by U.S. Soccer that covers them year round. Club team, national team, and then you have other players who don't have those contracts, and there is a similar system to the men's team in terms of paying them for doing things. The big issue, though, is that those per action bonuses are far, far smaller than the ones the men get, and that is kind of the crux, so to speak, of this equal pay issue. So how did we end up in this place, especially modernly, with the U.S. women's national team being so successful that we still have these huge differences in the way the two teams are paid? For one, the collective bargaining agreements, the CBAs, are negotiated separately. There are two separate players associations, one for the men's national team players and one for the women's national team players. And those negotiations don't have anything to do with each other. Each group is responsible for negotiating their own agreements with U.S. Soccer. The history is really important here, as it is around this entire discussion. When the U.S. Soccer Federation started paying women's players, even when it was a pittance, there was no league. There was no thought that you were getting a full paycheck somewhere else. It was seen as a part-time thing. Almost all of the women on those early national teams had full-time jobs back home. There's plenty of stories of women quitting their jobs because they so wanted to be a part of that team. And the first real money that anyone was getting were players like Mia Hamm signing endorsement deals. It wasn't coming from some steady paycheck to play soccer. This idea that the NWSL is going to be around for the long haul, confidence in that idea is still really new because, like I said, it is not the first attempt that the U.S. has had at a women's pro soccer league, and there was a lot of fear that it was going to go the way of the others and fizzle out after a few years. So the fact that it's finishing up its 7th season and feeling pretty confident, that says a lot about where we are right now in terms of the way women's soccer has developed over the last few decades. That said, the way the structure and how the USWNT is paid has evolved over the years is based on an idea that there weren't going to be regular paychecks for soccer outside of that system. Another unfortunate harsh reality of this is the financials, and the fact is the individual NWSL clubs could not afford to pay the U.S. women's national team players this $100,000 a year salary. There just isn't the money for it. So again, U.S. Soccer, in order to keep the NWSL healthy financially, right now doesn't have much of a choice but to support these women if they want them to be playing in this league. The idea that the women could leave and go play somewhere else in some other league in Europe, for example, that's something that the NWSL and U.S. Soccer should be very aware of when going into negotiations about how the women are paid, because there are options elsewhere. This is not, a monopolistic situation. The NWSL and U.S. Soccer's relationship is unique, and if it were to be broken, the floodgates could in theory open for women leaving and seeking better pay elsewhere. So, I want to quickly go through the timeline of how we got where we are in terms of the equal pay fight, particularly on the legal side. The team originally filed a class action lawsuit back in March. All 23 players on the team, so the entire World Cup team, has their names on this lawsuit. This is not just the big names going and suing, trying to use their personal clout. This is the team suing as a whole. So what do they want? So the basic argument is they want to be paid equally for equal work. This kind of goes back to the bonus structure and the differences between the two teams in how they're paid for equivalent accomplishments. The pay gets all, the press in this. It's the biggest talked about issue, but there's plenty of other stuff in this lawsuit. Travel, accommodations, personal training, sports medicine, the conditions of the fields they play on. So there's a lot of less sexy stuff that's in this lawsuit, but that is also fundamental to this idea of treating the two teams equally. Basically, though, on the money side, they're arguing that the salary part shouldn't be considered, that should be viewed as a separate issue, and that U.S. Soccer should be paying each team equally for, winning a World Cup game or making a friendly roster, making a World Cup qualifying roster, etc. So in the midst of all this, the US goes out and wins the World Cup. Obviously a huge deal, huge for the branding, huge for the marketing, and really the greatest thing the team could have done to improve their standing in the court of public opinion. Then a few weeks ago, US Soccer comes out with this fact sheet. And the fact sheet basically says, hey, over the last few years, we've actually paid the women more. And they're not actually underpaid. And this whole equal pay thing is distorted and misleading. And, we actually think we do a really good job of promoting the women's game better than anybody else in the world. That can be true. You can be the world leader in women's soccer and still be lagging behind what you should be doing. That's not mutually exclusive. What shortly happened after is the U.S. Women's National Team Players Association came out with a statement calling it complete BS. As I mentioned earlier, much of this information isn't public. We, the public, don't get to see the numbers and do the math ourselves and decide, wait a minute, they're lying or they're lying. A big data point, though, in the women's favor was that a couple days later, the Men's Players Association came out and said, yeah, this fact sheet doesn't check out. Which is a big deal because generally speaking in the history of the U.S. women's pay negotiations with U.S. Soccer, the men's players stay far, far away from this. It's a third rail usually. They don't go near it. They mind their own business. So the fact that the men's team came out and said, hey, this isn't right, says a lot about the women's national team argument that U.S. Soccer isn't being honest here. So take that for what you will. Also, even though they get paid less per action, and the salaries that the women receive still might not add up to the amount of money the men are paid for accomplishing things with U.S. Soccer, it's totally believable that the women could end up making more despite making less per win or per game because they win so much more. The men didn't even qualify for the last World Cup. So when U.S. Soccer says, hey, look, we paid the women a lot more the last few years? Well, no duh you did, because a huge paycheck that is normally cut to the men every 4 years didn't happen. And that's a huge missing line in the checkbook here, and it's a reason for why maybe U.S. Soccer can argue, hey, we've actually paid the women more, because it makes sense. A huge thing that gets lost in this discussion is the difference between equal and equitable. Equal meaning they're exactly the same. That's an objective statement. Whereas equitable is much more subjective. It would mean paying them according to their performance, in which case the women could probably argue that they deserve to be paid more than the men because they actually win things. But we're not going to get into that. They're not arguing for that right now, so that's a side conversation for another day. One of the most recent developments in this whole saga is that the two sides tried to go to arbitration, working out their differences outside of court, maybe trying to come to a settlement. To no one's surprise, after the fact sheet fiasco, that failed almost immediately. Arbitration lasted less than a week, and as a result, we have a court date, May 5th, 2020. Now, will we actually get to that court date? I have no idea. I'm not the best person to predict that. It's entirely reasonable we'll get a settlement before then, but based on the way the arbitration went, I actually won't be surprised if we see a full trial here with the U.S. women's team feeling pretty confident going into it, maybe not in the ultimate result, but simply in the momentum they have, especially with the public going into this fight. So what would equal pay for the women's national team actually look like? There's a couple roads here. The first question is, would they be willing to sacrifice those guaranteed national team contracts, take a normal NWSL contract, and then take larger bonuses on top of it? Basically, would they take the men's bonus structure but only be able to max out at making, say, $67,000 per year? Right now, I don't think they would. The NWSL is trending upward, but it's really not at a point yet where it's paying high enough salaries. Again, this gets back to the issue of if the salaries were going to be really low and they could just get the bonuses anyway, why not go play in Europe if a club over there is willing to pay more in terms of a salary? The result I don't think we're going to see is for the salaries to stay in place, but the women's bonuses to just jump up to the men's level. Because all of this is collectively bargained, the court just can't force that to happen. And I don't think U.S. Soccer, in any scenario, would agree to it. I also think the women's national team players know that isn't going to happen. So while that might be the dream version of equal pay, I don't think we're going to see that happen. Now, could we see a future where the men's and women's teams collectively bargain together? I think that's really an ideal scenario down the road. But again, with the NWSL not quite paying as well right now, I don't see it happening. But the men coming and standing up for the women's team after that fact sheet release, I think is a good sign maybe of things to come, that the two teams are going to be more eager to work together in terms of guaranteeing the kinds of treatment, compensation, and benefits they want to receive for playing for the United States national teams. So you can probably guess which side I lean toward on this at this point, but in terms of where I stand on all of this, I don't expect the lawsuit to be the big resounding win for the U.S. women's national teams. While I think all the CBA numbers are going to come out and we'll be able to find out what U.S. soccer was being truthful about and what they might have been fudging a bit, I just don't see the courts coming in and saying you have to pay them X amount of money. Something I could totally see coming out of this lawsuit, though, is all that other stuff. The conditions of the fields, the travel accommodations, the types of flights they take, all of that. At the end of this, I assume that it's going to be ruled discriminatory to do those things differently between the men's and the women's teams. While again, I think the collective bargaining agreements can be a bit of a barrier to what the court can order to happen, I think stuff like that is going to be ruled as pretty clear just discrimination, and there's no reason, again, a nonprofit organization should be treating its employees differently in that way. In the end, I understand why the salaries at club level are higher for men's teams than women's teams, or why the men's World Cup prize money is larger than the women's World Cup prize money. But again, U.S. Soccer can do whatever they want with the money FIFA gives them, or that they make from games, from ticket sales, from selling jerseys, all of that. No one can tell U.S. Soccer what to do with it, who to pay it to. And they're a non-profit organization. So if your goal isn't to make money, and your goal stated is to promote the growth of soccer across the United States and administer its national teams, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be treating every one of your players in an equal manner at their given level, youth level, senior level, what have you. So from my view, the ultimate goal down the road, and U.S. Soccer should want this, they shouldn't be fighting it, is so that the men's and the women's national teams to be treated equally by the federation, because in terms of the morals or the logic of it, there's no reason they shouldn't be.